Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today to discuss a subject of greatest urgency for our democracy, the future of journalism and the erosion of fact. I'm deeply grateful to the extremely busy writers and editors who have taken the time to be with us today for this important conversation. And I want to give special thanks to my colleagues Anne-Marie Lipinski of the Nieman Foundation and Nick O'Malley of the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School for joining with me in sponsoring this event and for helping to create such an excellent program. I can think of no more important question on which a university and the press could join forces. The pursuit of truth, veritas, as our motto has it, is at the heart of what each of us is and does. For centuries, universities have been places where knowledge was collected, studied, debated, expanded, changed, and advanced through the power of human reason and the crucible of rational argument and exchange. Like journalists, we regard facts as the necessary foundation for human decision-making and human progress in the policies of governments, in the discoveries of science, in the lives of individuals, societies, and nations. Yet we now confront what has been called a post-truth era, one in which evidence, critical thinking, and analysis are pushed aside in favor of emotion and intuition as bases for action and judgment. These are not just questions of epistemology. For journalism, they are matters of survival. In a transformed technological world of social media, which is where 2/3 of American adults now get their news, it is the popular acclaim of clicks, not the rigorous standards of depth and accuracy, that measure success and measure economic viability. Today's panelists are more than journalists. They're what we might call meta-journalists, individuals engaged not just in doing journalism, but in reflecting on and charting the future of their field. And I would add, the future of truth's possibility and availability for all of us in the years to come. This is no small responsibility. Last fall, The Economist referred to the dangerous weakening of society's truth-producing infrastructure. Universities and journalism are both essential parts of that infrastructure through their work of discovery and their commitment to rational analysis and accountability to proven fact. I look forward to learning today how together we can shore up these indispensable underpinnings of our democracy. Thank you for being here, and I now turn the program over to Nick O'Malley.
What else would you rather be doing on a snowy Tuesday afternoon than listen to a bunch of journalists? After one of the most incredible political campaigns in American history, it seems only right that we take a minute, a moment, a couple of hours this afternoon to really listen to and think about what it means to be a journalist. We're going to hear from a range of practitioners across the industry, and some of it will be discussion, but some of it will be storytelling, because at the end of the day, that's really, in part, what journalism is, a kind of truth-telling, storytelling together. I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Bill Kristol. He is the editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, a regular on ABC's This Week, and I'm sure you've seen him on many other television shows. He has a long association with this institution and was just describing to me a moment ago sitting in this hall as a freshman. A few months ago, Bill wrote the following: "But despite all of the technological changes in the industry, I think some people overestimate their effect. Real news and good analysis still matter most. The main task is to simply understand what's happening, to try to have a grasp of the dynamics, to try to figure out what might happen in the near future." So please, let's welcome Mr. Kristol.
Well, thanks, Nico, and thank you, President Faust, and others for having me back here to Harvard. I've spoken at Harvard many times, taught a little bit here too since I graduated, and both college and grad school here, but I'm not sure I've ever spoken here in Sanders Theater again, and it's intimidating, of course. I was trying to remember what course it was that this was during shopping period, I think, in my freshman year, the fall of 1970, that I came to listen to. I think it was John Finley, who was a great classics professor and master at the time, if we're allowed to use that word still, I don't know, of Eliot House, teaching Homer. I was extremely impressed. I thought that smart people should certainly study this unbelievably impressive type of work in the original language, and I realized that was too hard for me, so I became a government major. No offense to the gov majors here. And my wife, however, was a classics major, and now wife whom I met here actually was a classics major, so I still feel that at least some part of our family actually pursued a serious studies. I've spoken here many times, and it's usually easy to speak at Harvard. I just come, I make fun of all the, silly political correctness, the complacent progressivism, the identity politics. I quote the teachers I liked at Harvard, my teacher Harvey Mansfield and James Q. Wilson, Sam Huntington, friends I made since then, Ruth Weiss, John Levinson, to show that there are some good people at Harvard. And then I've pretty much finished my talk and outraged enough people, and then I can stop. But that would be, I was tempted to do that again today, of course, but unfortunately, it's not so easy simply to make fun of sort of the politically correct left anymore, since there's a bit of a problem in reaction to that, in part. We now have a illiberal populism of the right, I guess you'd have to say, produced only partly, in reaction to a kind of illiberal progressivism, I would say, on the left, which does raise serious problems, I think, for our country, for our politics, and for our future. I could, again, go on and sort of chortle a little bit about how all the critical legal studies law professors who were here when I was in grad school, auditing a couple of courses at the law school, and who went on and on about how law is just politics by another means, and you shouldn't take all these pretensions to the rule of law and neutrality too seriously, are now seeing their words put into practice, not quite in the way that they expected, that all the people who lauded identity politics doesn't seem to have occurred to them that groups they didn't like so much or whose policies they wouldn't have approved of so much could also get into identity politics, that race, gender, and class is a two-sided sword, so to speak. But I won't go on about all of that. I'll actually just confine myself to congratulating Harvard on the fact that the single most powerful person in the Trump White House is, I believe, a graduate of Harvard Business School, something I'm sure they're touting across the river right now. And this latter thing is to Harvard's credit. The man who I think is likely to be the Supreme Court nominee tonight, Judge Gorsuch, is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and that is something Harvard actually should be proud of. Steve Bannon, I'm not so sure whether the business school is so thrilled about everything he learned there. But you can't hold a college. God knows you can't hold a college or grad schools responsible for all their graduates. That would be something else. They do, on the other hand, like to take credit for the ones who do well. So, 3 quick points really about the media, and I want to hear my colleagues. And I came to journalism. I'm not really a journalist. I started the magazine with Fred Barnes and others. the Weekly Standard in '95, having come to Washington to be in government, which I was for about 7 years, having done some politics after that, having been before that a professor. Actually, I was at Penn, I think, with Drew Faust, and though in different departments. So I don't have a kind of professional journalist background, but obviously having edited the Weekly Standard for 20 plus years, and also having dealt with journalists a lot when I was in government and politics, and in other ways, I have a couple of thoughts. I'll make 3 points, and I'll try to keep them very simple and just assertive, since I don't have much time, and let other people, if they wish, say what they think of them. 3, make it easy, they each begin with a D. The first, disintermediation. The media is between something. I mean, Harvey Mansfield, my teacher, wrote an excellent piece, which I recommend to you. I just reread it last night. In 1979, The Media, World, and Democratic Representation. Very deep and interesting, much deeper, I'd say, than the normal sort of discussion of the media and democracy. And the piece begins, in a somewhat Mansfieldian way, the media are in the middle of something, that is for certain, but of what? But the media is a mediating institution. I mean, that's literally the case, and I think importantly the case in democratic politics. Obviously, for reasons mostly technological, some of them maybe sociological and others, it's less that today, because of the internet, social media, and stuff. Social media is called social media, but when you think about it, it should be called social non-media, because it precisely removes the mediating function, and it's direct. Again, which is in many ways a good thing, but a problematic thing, I think, for politics. That's not going to change, and that's mostly technology. The disintermediation is here to stay. It has huge financial consequences for newspapers and magazines and TV networks. It has huge political, sociological, cultural circumstances. I don't think we've seen most of them yet. I'm less pessimistic about that in general than a lot of my friends and colleagues, especially the ones my age, who have a certain tendency towards nostalgia, as many people do as we get older. I think that's a mistake, honestly. I think if one looks back, one would be a little horrified to go back and actually read newspapers or look at TV news shows from 30, 40, 50 years ago. It wasn't so great then, and in some ways the diversity of opinion, the depth you can get online, the immediacy of it is a very good thing for citizens and for political discourse. It also is a very problematic thing. But I'm not a friend of those who say that in the good old days you couldn't have had Trump, you couldn't have had other things that most of you probably would agree with me are a misfortune for our democracy. Joe McCarthy, was very successful before the internet, before social media. George Wallace won 5 states in 1968. All kinds of conspiracy theories flourished throughout American history in the 19th century and the 20th century before the modern disintermediation. So I think it's too simple to assume that all of our problems are due to this, but it is a big change, just as an analytical matter. The fall of the old media is, I think, a big deal. My second point after disintermediation is, they will begin with D to make it easy, demagoguery. I mean, Trump is a demagogue, I think. It's a Greek term, and in a way we've gotten out of the habit of using terms like that, but it's analytically a pretty precise term, and it's worth going back and read some of the sources on it. He's a pretty clever demagogue. I don't think he's world historical class. Let's hope not. Otherwise, he really could be successful and would be in a lot of trouble. I don't think that's actually that likely. But in thinking about Trump, we do need to rethink a little bit, I think, our somewhat complacent view that democracy is, the more democracy, the better, the more education, the better. I mean, the more participation, the better, and everything is moving in the right direction. The arc of history is going in a good way, and we don't have to worry about some of those things that the Founding Fathers worried about. It's amazing to go back and look at the Federalists. Look at how many of the papers, especially the papers on the executive, but also on the legislative power, are about precisely the threat of demagogues. And incidentally, if we make it in pretty good shape through Trump, and I won't be partisan here, so I'd say also through not so great administrations on the left, a lot of it is due to our constitutional structure, to what we inherited from the Founding Fathers, to what a lot of historians, political scientists, and others have taught we should sort of look down on as old-fashioned and out of place. Separation of powers, that's kind of cumbersome. I think an awful lot of people are very grateful to have it now. An independent judiciary, traditions in the bureaucracy, that old-fashioned place where they believe in due process and the rule of law, and they're not really into, you know, kind of fun-loving participation there. Nonetheless, it turns out those things are kind of useful to check some of the dangers of a democracy. So having a more problematic attitude towards democracy, demagoguery as one aspect, potential aspect of democracy, I think is a useful thing. Final point, I had to find a word that began with D, so it's not quite maybe the accurate word, but debility. I'd say the weakness, though, the debility of the media is a point I just want to put on the table, that if you get in a bunch of journalists and media types and editors, we all can be proud, we can be lamenting, we can beat our breasts, we can, but the presumption always is the media is powerful. That's the wish, I think, is that the media is powerful. It's an empirical question. I'm not sure it's the case. When I speak to conservatives, I always remind them that when were the great conservative victories? Reagan in 80, 84, Bush 88. Huge, lopsided victories, 3 of them in a row. Rush Limbaugh was not yet on talk radio. Fox News didn't yet exist. The internet didn't yet exist. All these things, the conservative media didn't exist. It really was the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the 3 networks, which were mostly moderate liberal, at least. Nonetheless, those were the heyday of conservative, that was the heyday of conservative policies. And incidentally, ever since Fox News took over and became such a big deal, Republicans have lost the presidential popular vote in every election but one, 2004. And it's not been such halcyon days for conservative policies, I wouldn't say. Younger people growing up in an environment where conservative media was more prominent seem to have managed to not become, unfortunately, as conservative as they might have been. So I'm a little dubious about the claims of the power of the media. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, honestly, depending on how much you like the media, how much effect you'd like it to have. But I think the idea that there's a straight line relationship between either the political views of the media and political events, or to get back to my first point, the character of the media, social media versus traditional media and stuff, and political events is probably not the case. I'm on the whole still optimistic. I think I actually am optimistic about the same thing that is the most worrisome, which is the sort of social media disintermediation. It just gives so much more opportunity for people to learn more. I do think the truth does sort of have a greater opportunity to correct falsehood, even if falsehood can take off awfully fast online. In the old days, falsehood could still take off awfully fast. The famous quotes about, you know, lies, ride a horse, and whatever it is, and truth can never catch up. Those come from before social media. The successful demagogues lasted an awful long time in the 30s and in the 60s, 50s and 60s before social media. So and the degree to which people can really see debate and diversity of opinion online, when not all of our major institutions have as much diversity as they should have, I think is a very hopeful thing. When I speak to students, they can't believe that when I was in college, you didn't have access to 25 different columnists and 100 different bloggers each morning to get a take on what, let's say, the Supreme Court nominee tonight, that you depended on what was reported in maybe 1 or 2 or 3 local papers, maybe the one national paper you could get at Out of Town News, you know, though even then, maybe that came a day late, and then the 3 networks, and that was it. That was it. No cable TV of different flavors, no radio, obviously no internet. I think on the whole, this is a healthy development, but it's not an unproblematic one. I ran into John McCain this morning, actually at National Airport. He was coming in from somewhere. I was flying out, and I asked him how things were going, and he responded, and I'll close with this, with one of his favorite quotations. I think it's a fake quotation, actually, in the sense, I mean, he really said it to me, but I think his description of it is fake. But he said, as Chairman Mao always liked to say, it's always darkest before it turns pitch black.
Bill talked about newspapers, which is a fine segue to our hometown paper, the Boston Globe. Quote, for generations, newspapers have been seen as expendable, fish wrap and kindling the day after they hit your stoop. But by its very nature, print is an artisanal product. You have to literally go out and cut down a tree to produce it. Treating it as such will yield rewards. We're already seeing it, and 2017 will certainly bring more. Those are the words of our next speaker, Kathleen Kingsbury, the managing editor for digital at the Boston Globe. Shortly after she joined the Boston Globe in 2013, she wanted to answer the question, the puzzle, of how can one of our fastest growing industries, the food service industry, carry a poverty rate 3 times that of any other industry in the country. In 2014, she wrote the editorial series Service Not Included, which focused on the financial plight of restaurant workers and the effects of income inequality. That led to her winning the Pulitzer Prize for her work on this subject in 2015. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kathleen Kingsbury.
Hi, good afternoon. Like most journalists I know, every morning when I wake up, literally the first thing I do is check my phone. On the morning of Sunday, June 12th, I found 6 emails from CNN, breaking news alerts. It wasn't even 7 a.m. yet. Dozens of people had been killed in a nightclub shooting in Orlando. This looks bad, I said to my husband. I've got to go to work. I was at the time the Globe's deputy editorial page editor. My boss actually happened to be on vacation, and so as I was turning on the coffee machine and switching on my TV, I started to text and email the editorial board. We needed to write something quickly. I've got to admit, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that my first reaction that day was not one of outrage. In fact, I was feeling something that many of you in this room might feel when these tragedies happen. I felt kind of apathetic, numb. And so did my team. We had just seen it too many times. San Bernardino, Charleston, Aurora, Sandy Hook. We had written polite opinion pieces after each of these events, demanding change, insisting on change. We had asked for more background checks. We had asked for smaller bullet cartridges. We had asked for better mental health screening. What had that all added up to? Nothing. This was still happening. The details were different that morning, but the story was so familiar. A killer with access to military-style weaponry mows down innocent Americans in cold blood. We felt like we had nothing left to write. And then something happened that almost never happens. In journalism, we have rules, and then we have cardinal rules. One of the cardinal rules for newspapers is that we try to keep our opinion pages in our newsroom separate. For the newsroom, that's a way to protect them from being accused of bias, to maintaining their objectivity. At the Globe, this maintains itself with the editorial page being tucked down a dark hallway that no reporter tries to venture. For context, up to that day, I'd probably been in the room with the paper's editor, Brian McGrory, twice in the 3 years that I had worked at the Globe. But that night, Brian sent a note. He suggested that this horrific event could not go unremarked upon, and that we, as an institution, needed to do something radically different. In fact, he went as far as to suggest that we should wrap the entire newspaper in an editorial, standing against this kind of lunacy. To my mind, though, one of the most extraordinary parts about this is that he wanted to work together. He wanted the editorial page and opinion pages to work with the newsroom on it. So the next day we got in a room. Editors, particularly from the news side, seemed visibly uncomfortable. Some of them were squirming. And I'll admit that I also kind of wondered what we were all doing there. But I think we all felt a similar fatigue, a desire to do something that could possibly move the dial. In fact, one of the easiest decisions for us to make that morning was the title of our project, Make It Stop. We all wanted to make it stop. It's one of those things that a lot of us had gotten into our business to do, to have impact, to change the world. whether you worked for the opinion pages or the newsroom. So how to actually accomplish that is a whole nother matter. Politicians still need and value citizens' voices, but you've got to reach them in ways that they cannot tune out. And at the same time, we wanted to reach far more than the inside the Beltway. We wanted to reach as many Americans as we could, and we wanted to use as many of the globe's various platforms as we could. So we went to work, and 3 days later, after very little sleep, this is what we came up with. So I should start by saying that 60 people across the Globe organization worked on this project. There were some reporters involved, but primarily it was editors, graphic designers, engineers, and social media experts. We felt strongly to start that we needed to have a discrete call to action. We quickly settled on calling for a renewal of the assault weapons ban. For some of us, this clearly didn't go far enough, but it was a concrete step. The US had had such a ban until 2004, and in fact, actually protect ducks from assault weapons. Yes, the US government makes sure that you cannot use an assault weapon to kill ducks, but not humans. And the Orlando shooting would never have been as deadly as it was if not for the fact that a man wielding this type of weapon was able to shoot off 24 shots in 9 seconds. Of the 300+ people in the Pulse nightclub at 2:02 a.m. that evening, 1/3 were struck with flying lead. We also wanted to create a graphics display to explain how we had gotten here. Who profited from this type of weaponry, and who in government allowed it to happen? And we actually ended up on accidentalboobtumblr.com. But we also wanted to push past reported stories of gunmaker revenue, past the sternly worded editorials that often fell on deaf ears. We also tried to give a sense of how deadly these weapons are. We chose to call out 6 US senators by name. None are diehard NRA members, making this a quite difficult decision, but instead they were moderates. They had voted against gun control measures in the past, but were vulnerable in close re-election fights and often represented fairly moderate districts. These were 6 people who we thought we could change their mind, and if we changed their mind, we could change the law. Again, we pushed past convention. We created pre-populated tweets and emails for our readers to send to the senators directly, asking for change. More than 8,800 tweets were sent, more than 10,000 emails. Finally, we took over the Globe's Twitter account. We created the hashtag #MakeItStop. And every 5 minutes, we tweeted out the name and age of every victim at every location of every mass shooting since the last assault weapons ban had been lifted in 2004. It took more than 30 hours to note every name. Here's just a few. One of the most amazing things about Make It Stop is that we actually saw progress from it in a rather short time. 2 days later, Kelly Ayotte, then the senator from New Hampshire, who had received the brunt of our texts and emails, changed her vote on an important gun control measure. No, the law did not change, but she changed her vote, and it felt like a huge victory. But it also wasn't a victory that everyone celebrated. Some of our colleagues distanced themselves from this project on social media. And a week later, I was asked to be on a panel at the Poynter Institute, the journalism ethics group. I thought I was going to be talking about gun control that day. Instead, I was grilled for almost an hour about why I thought it was okay to do this, why the Globe thought it was okay to cross these lines. And those were questions that were hard to answer. That day and since, I've thought a lot about them. Because you're taught in Journalism 101 some fundamental tenets. Be accurate, be fair, don't make yourself the story. By these measures, maybe Make It Stop had crossed some lines, had gone too far, maybe. But there are other responsibilities that we as journalists hold dear. Be a voice for the voiceless, tell essential truths, hold the powerful accountable. Marty Kaiser, the former editor of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, often talks about how, at the end of the day, even journalism organizations must have thresholds to allow for moral outrage. For the Boston Globe, that threshold was a group of young people at a nightclub enjoying themselves, being mowed down in cold blood. We cannot shrug our obligation to call out these atrocities as ones our community and our news organizations will not abide. Thank you.
Wow. What does it mean to be a journalist? I'm going to invite our panel to come on stage here while I continue this introduction. But as I'm waiting for them to come on stage, I want to just remind everyone that Sanders Hall here is full, but you can text and tweet your friends. They can watch it online at harvard.edu/live. And we have a hashtag for the event, hashtag Future of News. One of the amazing things about being on this campus is all of the resources and activities that happen. I'm the director of the Shorenstein Center. We have a range of activities, but there's also the Nieman Foundation for Journalism right here on campus. And you may or may not know that it publishes some of the best commentary and writing about the state of journalism, from Nieman Lab, which covers digital platforms and the digital future of news, to Nieman Reports. Anne-Marie Lipinski, the curator of the Nieman Foundation, wrote this in the last edition of Nieman Reports. We are, in all our media, a nation screaming past each other. President Trump, not satisfied to have won the election, continues his work as social media provoker-in-chief, energizing his followers and baiting a wounded press corps. The weeks since the election have underscored the urgency for new approaches. These waters feel uncharted. The ease with which a tweeted untruth can dominate a news cycle and hijack newsrooms for days is new in presidential politics. It comes at a time when lightning is the only acceptable speed for posting a candidate's utterances, let alone a president's. But we can apply news judgment in that moment between tweet and retweet, rather than serve as accomplices to destructive claims. With no evidence that the rhetoric has turned from campaign to presidential, journalism must cope quickly. I'd like to welcome our panel. David Leonhardt is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times and has spent the last year working with the Times to shape the future of the newsroom in the 2020 report. Next to him is Lydia Palgreen, the editor-in-chief of Huffington Post, who joins the Huffington Post this past December after nearly 15 years at the New York Times. Gerard Baker is the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones, and comes to that job after a distinguished career in the Financial Times, the BBC, and the Times of London. Let's give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, President Faust, for making this time and this space available to this amazing community. When we first started planning this, we said, do you think people are interested in what's happening with journalism? And I think the evidence is abundant before us. I'm just in a slight panic, though. It's hard to be away from the news for 2 hours. God knows what is happening while we've been sitting here. So please, those of you who are checking your phones, just shout out if anything major changes in the time that we're up here, and we'll try to incorporate it into the conversation. Inspired recently by Harvard historian Joe Lepore, I was reading correspondence from Thomas Jefferson to a newspaper editor who had written to him seeking his advice about his work. And Jefferson's advice was scathing. He wrote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." And he wrote to the publisher that really the only path to reformation that he could imagine was a 4-sectioned newspaper with the sections titled Truth, Probabilities, Possibilities, and then finally Lies. Truth, he thought, would be the smallest of the sections. So it was just reading this was a reminder to me that in many ways official disdain for journalism has been ever thus. Jefferson's characterization is one that could have come straight from the current White House. The language is not that different. And, but my question for all of you is, what is different about this period for journalism and the challenges that we're facing as we cope with a new administration and a new way of doing business with the federal government, and as we've been talking about this kind of post-truth phenomenon we're living through, what has changed? David?
What I love about that quote is that Jefferson, of course, is the founder who's the great defender of the press, right? So just imagine what the other founders said. I would say that at least 2 things have changed, and I'd be really interested to hear what Lydia and Jerry would say about that. One is what Bill covered, which is this disintermediation and this rise, this small d democratization of the media. I absolutely agree with Bill that it has more positives than negatives. It has huge positives and huge negatives, but that is an enormous change. The fact that everyone essentially has access to a printing press now is an enormous change, and everything that flows from that. And then I think the second thing that's changed is this polarization. I would argue now, as an opinion columnist, an asymmetric polarization between the parties that has helped lead to Trump and has helped lead to a political moment that feels more worrisome than any in my lifetime. And I would say those are the 2 fundamental changes. I actually agree with Bill that in the long arc of things, I think progress for both media and the country is still the better bet. But I'm more humble about that optimism than I was a year ago.
Lydia?
I'm both optimistic and pessimistic. I mean, one little tidbit of news, speaking of disintermediation, apparently Donald Trump is going to announce his Supreme Court nominee on Facebook Live. So the world will learn via this brave new technology. Look, I actually think that what we're seeing right now is a collapse of empathy in journalism. I feel as though journalism has become a highly elite profession that feels extremely distant from the experiences of the people that we write about. There was a lot of hand-wringing after the election about did we do enough to cover, the sentiments that were leading people to vote for Trump. And I feel like I read so much of that coverage. The problem wasn't that we didn't write about them, it's that we didn't write for them. There are so many journalistic products that are aimed at highly educated, affluent people. I spent almost 15 years working at the New York Times, which produces the most marvelous journalistic product I think the world has ever known. But it's speaking to a particular audience, and I think that what it fundamentally comes down to is this question of audience and who you're speaking to. And having that ability to speak not just about, but really speak to the experiences of people who fundamentally feel that the economic and political arrangements that govern our lives are unfair is really a huge part of the problem. And I feel that institutions like the New York Times, institutions like the Wall Street Journal, have a hard time getting access to that audience. And there are very powerful institutions that call themselves journalistic institutions that are building products that are directly targeted at that audience. There are organizations like Fox News and like Breitbart. So I look back to a period in the 1970s when you had columnists like Mike Royko working, Jimmy Breslin, people who had a real deep connection to people who felt disenfranchised from the establishments of power. Now today, who's the Mike Royko of today, of the gig economy? Chances are it would be a woman, perhaps it would be a person of color. But I think that journalism needs to rediscover its roots as a blue-collar profession and find a way to get back in touch with empathic storytelling.
It's interesting, and so Jerry is the editor of one of those elite publications. Do you share?
That used to be considered a compliment.
I know, I remember that.
Not anymore.
Do you share Lydia's view, and also what's different in this
moment? I do very much agree with Lydia, and I was going to say something quite similar. It's very apt to begin, as you did, Anne-Marie, with reminding us that cynicism about journalism is very long established. I'm English, as you can tell by birth, although I've lived in the States for more than 20 years, but English journalists have been held in particularly low esteem for a very long time. My favorite bit of doggerel from the mid-19th century goes, you cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to. So we used to do that. Look, I totally agree with Lydia and agree with David too. I think two things I would say are particularly challenging right now and perhaps have led us to this unfortunate, if it is that, pass. The first is, I think, an erosion of trust, which I think is an erosion of trust in so many of the institutions of civil society that we've seen over a very long period of time. It's not just journalism, but it is government. You just, on pretty well any measure, you take these opinion polls that ask people whether they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion, whether they trust or don't trust institutions, government, big business, since the financial crisis in particular has taken, and the Enron scandals and other corporate scandals, confidence and trust in big business has taken a huge hit. The church, but many churches, religious institutions, but particularly the Catholic Church, in the last 20 years. Many professions, particularly the only institution actually in this country that continues to enjoy the level of trust that it enjoyed 50 years ago is the military. That's a pretty across-the-board decline in the public's willingness or ability to trust. I think as it applies to journalism, it is particularly acute. I think these days, unfortunately, because many journalists, including my colleagues here, do excellent work incredibly conscientiously, a lot of journalism just is not trusted. And this leads to this phenomenon that is hinted at and that President Faust talked about in her remarks, that I think is is many ways the key challenge we face right now, which is this issue of post-truth, if you like, post-fact. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great New York senator, was famous for when he was having an argument with someone, he would say to someone, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That's no longer true in so much of political debate and so much of general public discourse these days. It's extremely hard to get people to agree on facts. If you talk to Donald Trump supporters and you report facts about Donald Trump that we have every confidence believed to be true, or facts about the economy that we believe to be true, or facts about the state of the world, or terrorism, or guns, or anything else you want to say, many of his supporters will just actually just not accept the facts. As a newspaper editor, I deal with literally thousands of letters a week from people challenging our journalism, not on the basis that they disagree with the conclusions of it, or our editorial page, they disagree with the editorial page. They just don't accept the fact. They don't accept the report. They don't and it comes back to this issue of trust. So we are in a difficult, a particularly difficult environment, because these days people actually can, in effect, choose their own facts, and they can ignore facts that are inconvenient to them.
So what are each of you, how are you thinking, that's such a existential problem for journalism as it is for other institutions in this country, but how are you each thinking about that challenge? And what are you doing in your own practice or your own newsroom to try to solve for that, or at least address it? And it's a question I get a lot from non-journalists too. You know, what are you guys doing about this? It's a problem. And even from people who are, you know, cheering and rooting for the survival of the industry.
I'll talk for a minute about the Times as an institution. And I would guess that the Journal would say the same thing. The president talked in her opening remarks about this idea of clicks above all, which is what has to drive so much of media, simply because of the economics, that the only way for media to fund itself is essentially to attract an audience large enough to get advertising against it. The New York Times is making a fundamentally different bet. We are not making a bet about clicks. We're making a bet about building a paying audience of a few million people around the world who are willing to pay for our journalism. And what we have said in a few different strategic documents that are trying to guide the place is we are willing to forfeit clicks for subscribers. An article that appeals to subscribers and makes someone feel like, wow, that's why I'm willing to pay you, because you put someone on the ground in Africa or in upstate New York, or you have someone covering the Federal Reserve, which I promise doesn't drive a lot of clicks. That to us is more valuable than an article, and I'll pick on myself, telling people to go a month without eating sugar, right? Which got more than 1 million clicks, right? But having the person on the ground in another continent is more valuable. And so there has to be a fundamental optimism at the root of it, right? If we say that truth is no better than falsehoods, then we're done. We should just pack up and go into a different line of work. We have to have an optimism that in this more liquid market for information, that truth will ultimately win out. And so the bet that we're making is that if we provide people with journalism that they decide is worth paying for, in the end, that not only produces a sustainable business, but it also is deeply consistent with the values that we all got into journalism for. Now, I become a little bit less optimistic when we start turning to journalism writ large, because that business model is not available to local papers the way it's available to the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the New York Times. We're sort of skimming off a paying audience around the country and around the world. But that's what the New York Times is betting on.
So go ahead, Lydia.
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, that actually is a tremendous service to the entire ecosystem, right? I mean, the fact that the New York Times is doing that means that the Huffington Post doesn't have to. I mean, not in the sense that we're going to aggregate and steal your traffic, right? But that, to me, the tremendous gift that the New York Times gives to the world is that it does that work, and the rest of us can do other things and react to it in a way that feels that it adds to the conversation.
One of the things that is particularly troubling at this moment is the way in which the basic building blocks of journalism and storytelling are, there's so much contention around them, and it's just words. And the language we deploy to describe a our political condition has always been debated. You know, an example is, are you a newspaper that describes a group as pro-life or anti-abortion? And are you making a political choice in choosing one of those? But the new battleground includes everything. Just seems like everything really is now up for debate, and it includes simple words like lie, which I think is one of the, first sort of bad words you learn as a child, right? It's a bad thing to do. We all think we know what it is. But now it seems like we don't know what that is. Newspapers making different decisions about that. Words like fake news, which we thought we knew what that meant, and now it's been co-opted to mean something, to mean error, for instance, not just manufactured lies. And in the last 48 hours, use of Muslim ban and majority Muslim countries have entered the lexicon, the news lexicon, and are also being debated. Jerry, you last night wrote to your newsroom asking your journalists to stop using the phrase 7 majority Muslim countries, and you wrote, "It's very loaded. The reason they've been chosen is not because they're majority Muslim, but because they're on the list of countries Obama identified as countries of concern." Can you talk about that decision in writing to your newsroom about that? And for all of you, is it even, can we find a common language at this point in such a divisive
So to be clear,
moment?
I didn't ban the use of the words majority Muslim countries. I said that if we're going to use that term, and we used it repeatedly today, including in multiple stories today, we do need to make sure that it's not the only description of the countries involved. Because if you describe a country as a majority, if you describe an action taken against a country, and then say, well, 7 countries, and this action was taken against majority Muslim countries, the strong inference I think that a lot of readers will take from that is because it is a majority Muslim country. And of course, we won't get into the substance of this debate, but the 7 countries were chosen because they weren't even identified in the presidential, in the executive order. They were chosen because they had been previously identified. So what I was saying was that when we absolutely use the word majority Muslim country, but we must also explain, we must use other words, including that they had been previously identified by the previous administration as, I think the phrase was countries of concern. So it wasn't about not using that term, it was about making sure that that term was put in context and it was understood that this, this phrase Muslim ban has been thrown around. It's not a Muslim ban, okay? There are 49, I think, majority Muslim countries in the world. 7 were identified in this. There are probably this weekend thousands of Muslims were able to enter the United States. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims who live in countries that are not affected by this ban who are still completely free to enter the United States. So we do need to be, this is very emotive. I understand why people use it. It was initially obviously a phrase that Donald Trump had himself used, but he subsequently retreated from that. But we do need to be very careful about that language because we do need to be very precise. I am an absolute stickler in all of our coverage for precision in language because, as you say, words are loaded. They have political meanings, they have cultural meanings, and they have identities that go beyond simple words. The issue of lie, you mentioned the word lie. You say it's a simple word. It's a short word. I would challenge whether or not it's a simple word. There are many, many different types of lies. There are multiple types of lies. When someone goes before a court of law or an inquiry and is asked if they did something and they say 50 times, I don't remember, I don't recall, is that a lie? It's very probably an untruth. It's probably an attempt to deceive. If someone goes out and says something one day and then says the next day I didn't say that thing, that's much more clearly identifiable as a lie. If somebody goes and says I saw there were thousands of people celebrating on the rooftops of New Jersey on 9/11, that is clearly something that we can challenge and test against all the known evidence and the facts. Is it a lie? To say that something is a lie requires a knowledge of the state of knowledge of the person when he said that thing, and also a state of knowledge of the moral intent of that person, that it was an intent to deceive. That's an incredibly high bar for reporting. And I think we speak to people in our newspaper, thousands of people probably a day. I suspect that some of them tell untruths some of the time. If we are going to try to read their state of their knowledge at the time they make those statements and their moral intent when they make those statements, we are setting ourselves, frankly, an impossible burden. What we can do, what we should do, and what we have done repeatedly is if Donald Trump, or anybody else for that matter, says something, we can say, this is not true, it's false. If he says, I mean, the perfect example was when he went before the CIA and said that this whole thing of a dispute between him and the intelligence community was all got up by the media. He had actually said at his press conference a week or so earlier that the CIA, that the intelligence community were treating him the way the Nazis behaved in the 1930s. So we were able to say that was a full statement. Again, is it a straight lie? That's something that requires a knowledge on the part of my knowledge on the part of what he knew and of what he intended to say. And I just think that, look, we're all reluctant to use the word lie. The New York Times, which has started using it in headlines, I think maybe has used it twice. And I don't believe that anybody here thinks Donald Trump has only lied twice in the course of the last year. So we are cautious about using the term. What we're not cautious about is the truth. Telling the truth, finding out the truth, reporting it, explaining it, and when someone says something that is not true, saying that it's not true.
Lydia, how are you navigating these questions of how do we even talk about truth and untruth?
Yeah, I guess I would like to just come back to this question of Muslim majority, because I think that there are a lot of different ways to describe the 7 countries, right? One possible description is this is a group of countries, that has never produced a terrorist that has killed anyone in the United States. Now, if I, as the editor of the Huffington Post, used that as the description for these 7 countries in our routine coverage, I think people would rightly call me out and say, that's ridiculous. That's a tendentious way to describe this. You're taking sides. But my challenge to my colleague, Mr. Baker, is that it's really about power. The administration is setting the terms and setting the language with which we're talking about a highly, highly contentious, unorthodox issue that is deeply emotive and gets right to the core of our identity as a country. And to simply, and I think blithely, use that language without interrogating it and without saying, this is really a fundamental shift, to me feels problematic. So the fact that it's a Muslim majority country and the fact that these are things, that these are countries that were on some list that the Obama administration had made, those are facts and they're relevant facts. It's also a fact that none of those countries has actually produced a fatal terror attack in the United States. So, for me, what it comes down to is, am I taking my facts and ordering them and prioritizing them based on who's in power at the particular moment? Or am I stepping back as a journalist and thinking about this in the context of our country's history, our country's traditions, and our fundamental values? And I think that's our job as journalists, not to accept the language that's given to us by power, but to interrogate it at every turn.
I agree completely, and that is exactly what we did in our coverage of the ban when it was announced from Friday all the way through the weekend. We looked at exactly that issue, that there had been no attacks from any of these countries, that no national security experts really believed that you could really draw a line between visa applications probably from these countries and the likelihood that there would be terrorist attacks. We reported that extensively. We reported on the damage that could potentially be done to US national security by the fact that these people from these countries were being barred from coming to the United States, and that the image of the United States that would percolate through the Muslim world and through the rest of the world, where there's been great hostility to the decision. We reported on the challenge that it represented to sort of American traditional policy and openness towards immigrants and towards refugees, and the damage that would do to the United States. We reported on the damage that it would do to the US economy by the fact that various companies would now be limited in their ability to have employees from these places. We completely, I mean, we didn't simply, again, it would be wrong to say that we simply reported what the administration, I mean, not that one could figure out what the administration was saying, because it changed so many times between, 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon and 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, but we reported that, but we absolutely tested all of the administration's claims, all of the reasons for doing this, against all of the evidence, against all of the reporting that we could muster, and we reported all that and laid it out very clearly. I don't think anybody reading the Wall Street Journal's coverage of this weekend weekend would be left in any doubt as to the potential damage that would result from this decision.
David, we're living with a set of conditions that in some way were supposed to be among the answers to the trust problems posed in journalism, and it was this sense of the democratization of journalism, right? That mainstream media would take their place alongside a proliferation of new websites and new channels, the dawn of the citizen journalist who was going to supply some of the, right some of the wrongs, create new levels of trust. There's certainly more noise, and there's certainly more content, but has that addressed any of the trust problems, and sort of how'd that work out for us?
I don't know whether it's addressed the trust problems, but I do think at this moment it's very difficult to remember that there actually have been positives from this small d democratization of media, because we're at this very fraught period in our country, right? And but the media and the sort of disintermediation of media did not create by itself this moment. And even at this moment, I think it's important to remember that there really are some positives from these developments. I've told this story before. I was an intern at the Washington Post in the summer of 1994. And I wrote this capstone story at the end of my summer that I was really pleased with, that got stripped across the top of the Metro page of the Washington Post, about the negotiations to build a downtown sports arena in Washington. It's now called the Verizon Center. And all these big players in Washington business were involved in it. And the one problem with my story was that I had one factual mistake. I spelled someone's name wrong. And I had the misfortune of spelling the name incorrectly of Katharine Graham. For future reference, it's Katharine. That somehow got through my editor and my copy editor. And the way I found out about this mortifying mistake was a week later, there was an item in the Washington City paper that said there's a special place in the dungeon of the Washington Post for David Leonhardt. The Washington City paper is the alternative weekly in Washington. Now, think about what happens if a Washington Post reporter makes that mistake today. It is corrected on Facebook or on Twitter within minutes, right? And the humiliation still happens, but the error probably never even makes it into print. Now, that's a relatively small error in the scheme of things, but let's expand it to an article that gets something fundamentally wrong about the Federal Reserve's interest rate, or an article that says someone won a state that the candidate didn't win. Or maybe more importantly, an article that gets the economics or the politics of something wrong, or says that a candidate lied, or to use Jerry's words, didn't use a falsehood, when in fact the candidate did use a falsehood. Imagine some really important mistakes. In the past, those mistakes would take days to be corrected. They would be out there for a long time. If it was a matter of some subjectivity, you might have to persuade an editor, a letters editor at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal that in fact you deserved to be heard on what you believed was this inaccuracy or this incompleteness. Now it is much, much easier for our readers to say, you got this wrong, or you got this incomplete. And I do think that there are real benefits to that. Maybe that doesn't help the trust of the media, but I would argue that even if it doesn't help the trust of the media, it can help the quality of discourse, which is ultimately even more important than whether people like us are trusted.
So there's been a lot of self-reflection among our colleagues for our behavior during the reporting of the election. Because somehow it was our responsibility to let people know that this was going to happen, is the basic notion. And I think underlying that notion is that we'd convinced ourselves and the public that the shiny new toys were more highly functioning than they really were. That polling was better and more accurate than it really is. That data was the same as fact. Or understanding, and it turned out that neither of those things really was true. And I also think there's another element of It's certainly our job as journalists to speak truth to power, as Katie reminded us earlier this afternoon. And we spend a lot of time and a lot of important resources discovering wrongs and pointing those out and trying to correct those wrongs, which is one of the purposes of the project that Katie talked about. But it also feels like maybe we've not, as an industry, done a very good job of articulating and explaining the way that things actually work and when things work and why they work. Success stories in government or in our communities. And I don't mean this is the old saw like positive news, but actually explaining how things function at a higher level. And I've come to think of this as, you know, a question I have is, did we in part create the conditions, a portrait of a nation in need of being made great again? Have we overstated the sort of Blade Runner notion of the problems that one of the candidates set out to solve?
I mean, I think we need, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I think we need to be real about the fact that this country has very serious problems. You know, inequality, you know, is like we've really never seen.
And you don't think we are, Lydia? You don't think that we are, explore that?
No, I think we do, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of distance and complacency to the way in which we write about these things. I mean, you know, globalization was supposed to increase the total size of the pie, and everyone was going to get a bigger slice. It didn't work out that way. Technological progress was supposed to mean that productivity would grow ever larger, and everyone's slice would get bigger. It didn't work out that way. As my former colleague David wrote, you know, my generation is the last that has a better than 50% chance of out-earning our parents. So this notion of ever-expanding prosperity and possibility is really under attack. And we're facing a time of deeply diminished expectations. And I don't actually feel like we've done a great job of telling that story in a way that feels true to the people that are actually experiencing it. I feel like we've been descriptive, but to our audiences rather than to the people that are experiencing it.
Yeah, I totally agree with Lydia. Look, I mean, just the data are there. You've got the fact that since, you know, in the last 8 years, I mean, since the financial crisis, since the recession induced by the financial crisis, growth in the United States has averaged just about 2%. Given the scale of the decline of GDP in the recession after the financial crisis, that's a historically incredibly weak performance. And I'm not portioning blame here, but just as a matter of fact, it's an extremely weak performance. That, on top of that, you've had a much longer-term weakness of performance, particularly with regard to median incomes. Right now, again, there are measurement issues, and we can argue about hedonic indexes and all this kind of stuff, but the general picture is pretty strong, which is that for most people, for people on median incomes in this country, they have not seen any significant improvement in their standard of living for the last 20 years. This is not something that Americans are used to. It's the longest period of stagnation of median incomes since we started keeping serious records of these things back in the 1930s. And this point, and again, Lydia's absolutely right, this point about inequality, and I do think this is what so much an important driver of the support for Donald Trump and indeed for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. Inequality, the explosion of inequality has become really something, one of the most striking economic and political and social phenomena that we've seen in American history in at least the last 50 years. And my favorite statistic, which I will give you once again, I've used it on multiple occasions in public fora, but I will give it again here. 50 years ago, in 1967, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company earned, on average, total compensation 20 times that of his or her average employee. That number today is 320 times. The average CEO of a Fortune 500 company earns 320 times the average income of his or her employees. That is, again, I pass no normative judgment on that, and I can explain all of that in terms of stock-based compensation and globalization and the importance of technology and the challenge to traditional labor models. But that is an extraordinary phenomenon. There has been an extraordinary enrichment of the very top people in this country, which has been literally unparalleled in this nation's history. And that has not been shared, not even remotely shared, by the vast majority of the people in the country. And I think I'll just say this, just conclude by saying this, we at the Wall Street Journal did focus on a lot of this in the campaign. We wrote a particularly memorable series called The Great Unraveling, which looked at these technological, trade, social, cultural, political phenomena that were creating this tremendous, I think, alienation on the part of many working class, middle class people in this country. Particularly interestingly, we wrote about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and Iowa, these states, all of which voted for Trump. And I think, so I fundamentally disagree with your premise. There is a profound set of economic and political challenges in this country. If you think some people may think Donald Trump's the answer, some people may think Bernie Sanders is the answer, but there's clearly a lot of discontent and people are crying out for change.
There's a tension here. I agree that we in the media do have this bias toward the negative, right? We just do. The bar for getting a story on the front page, if it's a negative story, is a lot lower than if it's a positive story. And I actually think it should be lower, right? Because we don't want to write a story every day like, the sun came up today, that was great. But I do think I think the distance is too great, and I think we do have too much of a negativity bias. And I think some of the rise of so-called explanatory journalism, like Jonathan Cohn, who works with Lydia, who's just fabulous, like the folks at Vox, like Slate, which was really ahead of the curve. I think part of the reason people have been drawn to that is that a lot of that journalism is willing to say, hey, this is working, and that's news, or this bit of bad news that you're reading about on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal actually isn't important. So it is true that we have this bias that I think we should struggle against. I don't think that explains the anger. I mean, to quote Bill Kristol again, we are less powerful than we think. What explains the anger is not that our stories have been too negative, it's the reality. It's the fact that, as Jerry just described, we are in an economic slump, a long-term economic slump for most of this country that's unlike anything before. It's not the way the media is writing about that slump.
Well, and I also, just to build on that and bring it back to the media, I think that with this kind of untethering of a group of people who are doing much better than everybody else, there is a set of media organizations that are not necessarily thriving, but I think have a much better chance of surviving because they cater to the group that's succeeding. And everybody else is just left to kind of mass media. Some of that is okay, some of it is really lousy, but I think you're seeing this kind of untethering happening in the media space, just as it is in every other. It's happening in education, it's happening all over. And so I think we really need to think about the relationship that elite media, the quality media have to the broader population and the people who aren't ultimately going to become New York Times subscribers or Wall Street Journal subscribers, because that distance, I think, is becoming much too great.
I want to talk a little bit about what's happening that we're seeing in a very different way than we have in a long time, which is the actual journalists' interaction with the White House. There's been a lot of focus on what's happening in the briefing room. We care a lot more about the briefing room now than we have in a while. And David, you're recalling the horror of misspelling Mrs. Graham's name. We all have a memory of something, a bad fact that we put into a newspaper or on air. And for me, it was as a young reporter covering my first, what in Chicago would be known as a heater story, a crime story, and somebody in a position to know in the prosecutor's office lied to me about something. He said DNA evidence proved one thing when in fact we would later know that it did not. And I put that into the newspaper. And when I found out that I'd been lied to and had put this into the newspaper, you're of course horrified, but I also did something that would be very common to all of you. I stopped trusting that person as a source, and I didn't quote that person in the newspaper maybe ever again. We're in the situation now where we are watching paid government officials sometimes go before the press corps in the briefing room and say things we know not to be true. And yet we keep airing these moments, and they've become now very much a part of the kind of, national panoramic of what we're seeing about our government. And I think a lot of non-journalists are asking the question, why are we still talking to some of these people? Why are we still airing some of these encounters? Kellyanne Conway got a lot of attention for the phrase alternative facts. I actually thought there was a sentence in that interview that was more startling and of concern to me, and it's when she said, "These are the facts that I want the press corps to cover." Which is, just to be clear, is not how it works. This isn't how any of that works.
Well, if I may say so, there's nothing new about spin about governments wanting the press to focus on one set of facts rather than another set of facts.
I understand that, but we are, I think that this has become just this national theater now, and we're watching this, and I think a lot of really concerned people, non-journalists, are saying, why are you in that conversation? Why don't you stop talking to people who you know to be lying or manipulative? How should we be, are there fundamental changes to the way we cover Washington or cover the White House that we need to think about embracing?
So I would say that there's some things that aren't new, right? We've all been lobbied by the Obama administration, the Bush administration. You keep going back to focus on some facts and rather than others. But this is new, right? We have not had, I agree with Jerry about the fact that news stories should be quite conservative about using the word lie because it implies intent. I don't think we should be conservative about using untruth and falsehood. And we have never had a president or an administration that has been as comfortable promulgating falsehoods as this one in its first 10 days. It is qualitatively different from either the Obama administration or the Bush administration. And the list could go on. And so I think we do have to think about how we deal with that. I think one way we have to deal with it is really to think about when, and the answer is different for each medium, right? Television has some challenges, right? Because you can't ignore the President of the United States. You just can't. The notion that we're going to ignore the President, I think again, it ascribes too much power to us. If we all got in a room and said, we're going to ignore Donald Trump, well, he's still the President, and that's not going to happen anyway. I think the key is to remember, there's a lot of political science research on this. The key is to remember that if you are putting the falsehood out there and then saying in the 6th paragraph it's false, you're not doing your job. Right? A headline that says Trump calls for voter fraud investigation is a disservice to journalism, right? It's harder to write the pithy headline, but it's, Trump promulgates a falsehood about voter fraud and calls for an investigation. And I think that's the tension that we really need to do, because this administration is trafficking in untruths in a way that we have not seen in decades.
I think there is a bit too much depth there. Again, as someone who's worked in both the British media and the American media, one of the things that is striking for British journalists about the way the American media, particularly the way the American press who cover the White House, is there is a tremendous amount of deference shown to the American political leadership. And it's tricky because, especially with the president is the head of state and has, the entitlement to some dignity and deference. But at the same time, the famous line of another British journalist is, his approach whenever he was interviewing a politician was, "Why is this lying bastard lying to me?" And that more or less captures has captured the posture of British journalists. But I think it was very striking, by the way, in the run-up to the Iraq War. In 2002, 2003, British journalists were much more aggressive about challenging what was being said about the intelligence, showing that Iraq had, purporting to show that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, much more aggressive, and there was, as a result, I think, much more political division in Britain that came about as a result of the fact that the press, I think, were much more skeptical. So I think a bit, frankly, I don't disagree with what David said about this White House. I mean, I think your question is, why do we even bother to talk to them, listen to them? Well, they are still the government. They have control over tremendously important parts of our lives, including the ability to wipe us all out if they want to. So I think we probably do need to listen to them. But again, as David says, we need, when they tell us things that are not true, we need to point that out, and we need to make sure that we are not being deferential. We may be polite and respectful to them, but that we're not being cravenly deferential towards them in a way that I think, frankly, sometimes the press perhaps has had a tendency to be.
I think also, one of the most heartening things that I've seen is the way in which journalistic institutions are really beefing up and rising to the occasion, making really, really big investments and big bets on investigative journalism. Jay Rosen had a piece the other day with sort of 20 things that journalists should do to survive the Trump era, and one of them was, send the interns to cover the briefings, and ignore the theater, go get down whatever Sean Spicer has to say for the record, but save your big guns and your most fruitful efforts to uncovering things that you're not going to find in the briefing room. No good stories come from briefing rooms.
Right, that's been eternally true, and yet there we are. The New York Times brought Peter Baker back. He'd been covering the White House. They sent him to Jerusalem for about 10 minutes and then brought him back after the election to go back to the White House. And I am concerned that the folk doubling down on 1600, that room effectively, that there are stories we're going to miss while we're so focused on the drama of the sort of passing reality show. Why not send a group of junior journalists and to have a live feed that anyone can look? Why are we spending so many of our dwindling resources on that space?
But the New York Times didn't recall Peter Baker to go to the briefings. If you read the stories that Peter wrote that drove the Obama administration totally nuts, if you read his wonderful 600-page book about the Bush administration, what you see is Peter, like many other White House reporters, is the fundamental job is not going to the briefing. It's doing reporting around the briefing. Mm-hmm. The stuff that is in the stories that the best White House correspondents do, almost none of it comes from the briefing. And so I'm sympathetic to the send the interns idea. I just want to make sure that we're not equating what great White House reporters do, and it is a hard beat, where every day you go to work and basically told you're scum by the people you're covering. I don't want to equate that with stenography.
Including by the Obama administration. I think everyone forgets that the Obama administration, in terms of prosecuting leaks, in terms of, giving access, all of those things. Obviously I'm not equating it to the Trump administration, but, let's not all have amnesia about, the halcyon days of covering the White House during the last 8 years.
If you want to know sort of what, and I've never been a White House reporter, but if you want to know kind of what some of the day-to-day combat of being in some of those jobs is like, watch some of the TV after a sporting event. The tension and the disdain that you see between athletes and journalists is not so different from what a lot of our colleagues experience who cover Congress and the White House.
So I wanted to ask a last question of you all, and I was rereading former President Obama's last interview in office, and one of the things he said to a group of podcasters is, "My instinct is everybody hates media right now. Everybody knows that the political culture doesn't work. So that has to be an opportunity," he said. I have this very intense feeling that in this very difficult time, I share his view of it as an opportunity. I know we've been dwelling on a lot of the problems here, but it seems that the good news in media being scrutinized so intensely is it's also a chance for people to take a look at us for a second time. I do think there are people concerned now about the future of journalism that maybe had tuned out to the questions that we were dealing with. You know, it wasn't that long ago that the group of us sitting here would have been here to talk about, you know, the death of the business model and what we were going to do about that. But we're refocused again on some very, very fundamental questions about the future, the very essence of journalism and the future of a democracy with journalism at its center. I'm wondering what, if you are feeling glass half full, glass half empty, and what you would tell people who ask, and I'm sure they've asked you as they've asked me, what do you want us to do? What can we do on behalf of journalism? There's a facile answer, which is make sure you're paying for all the things that you're reading, you know, subscribe to them. But that's not enough, right, in this moment. It's great that subscriptions are up across the line, but that's not sufficient. So, Jerry, is this an opportunity?
Well, I continue to see the glass as 1/10 full rather than 9/10 empty. So I'm very optimistic. Look, I don't think, again, I think we can get a little carried away. There is lots of great journalism out there. Lots of it is done by the organizations, you know, represented on this stage. Lots of it's done by lots of institutions that aren't. There's a lot of people who are, you know, dedicate themselves, you know, it's not a particularly financially rewarding life, but it is intellectually, and I would argue ultimately emotionally rewarding to pursue quality journalism. And I think there are a lot of people out there who do it, and by all means, support those people who are doing it. Support good quality journalism, subscribe to good quality news organizations. I don't think we should get too carried away. Look, there are lots of challenges, and we haven't talked about the business model, and I do completely also agree with Lydia on the cultural gap between too many journalists, and particularly the way this has become true over the last 50 years, where journalism has gone from being a craft to being a kind of a profession, and I think that has led to an enormous gulf between journalists who largely live in the major metropolitan areas, who all went to the same universities, including this one, who all move in the same circles, who've never really seen anyone with a gun, who are sort of live in a post-religious secular environment. They don't know what's going on in much of this country. They really don't. And that is a problem. Journalists need to get out and do it. But that's one of our biggest challenges. We have to face, we have to be more willing to get out and to go and actually find the stories. But I think as long as people need good quality information that they can rely on for decisions that they make in their own lives, social, civil, business decisions, they are going to treasure quality journalism, and they're going to be prepared to value it, and they're going to be prepared to pay for it. So we can be very gloomy, but I think in the end there is a demand for this kind of journalism, and there's a need for this kind of journalism, which is going to be met.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think that I would even go one layer deeper. I mean, let's not forget Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did in the popular vote. You know,
That's not what I heard from the White House.
Yeah.
But at least President Trump got much bigger crowds for his inauguration.
Much bigger crowds for his inauguration. And if those illegal voters hadn't voted. I mean, you know, her margin, you know, she lost 3 states by a very narrow margin. And I think I think there's a lot of freaking out going on right now, and it's completely understandable. But I think that we have to remember that there were a significant number of people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 and then voted for Trump in 2016, right? What that says to me is that this country is not divided into, you know, rabid, heartless bigots and, dreadlocked, you know, beanie bag. My references are all hopelessly out of date. Please forgive me. I'm officially over 40 now.
Yeah.
That's what we used to do back when we went to protests. That's not the reality, you know. I think that there is a vast group of people who are being very poorly served by journalism, who fundamentally are persuadable. And I think that what we've seen is this fragmentation, almost a kind of like parliamentary system style fragmentation of the electorate, and kind of a freak weather event almost that has led to the electing of a demagogue. And I don't think that, I think my hope, and the part that I hope to play, and I think that all of us need to play, is by renewing our commitment to civic engagement. I think that we have had a kind of abdication to assumptions about growth and prosperity, and that things are just going to get better, and that we can outsource the management of our democracy to the professionals, and everything's going to be okay. So I think that the civic re-engagement needs to happen at a much deeper level than just, you know, the information layer of it. I think we all need to wake up and realize that this is our country, and it's our responsibility to go out there and take actions that forge bonds between people. And that sounds like kumbaya, it sounds, but I really do think that we've been through this period where there has been this abdication, and where people are going about their lives and not really thinking about their role in civic life. And it's not on journalism to fix that. We can help get there, but it's not our job to fix it. We just need to renew that social compact.
Can I just push just on one thing? So how are you going to close that gap between those voters and you thinking of their candidate as a demagogue? Like, how do you push past that?
I mean, I think one of the things you do is listen. I mean, one of the great advances that social media has brought to journalism is the ability to be in a constant conversation, and for it not to just be us handing down information on, on tablets from the mountain, but actually listening and engaging with our audience. Now, in the pages of the Huffington Post, are we every day saying that Donald Trump is a demagogue? Absolutely not. But I think that we can write in an empathetic way about the lived experience of people who voted for Donald Trump in a way that I think will be meaningful and will help to create this sense of fellow feeling. It's not an easy task, but I think it's one that we have to take on.
Lydia used the word engagement, and you asked what should readers do? People are wondering what should they do, particularly with media. And it actually makes me, if I may have a personal anecdote, think of my father, which is if it got to be 8 in the morning and my dad hadn't read the New York Times, he would just start basically shaking, right? And by 8:30, he'd found about 5 things in it that he was complaining about. And so that's what I would sort of say to all of you, which is subscribe, pick a newspaper, pick a couple, pay for it, and then find some things in it that you don't like, and engage with it in that way. And put on Facebook when you think the media falls short. When you think the media's coverage of, say, the WikiLeaks email scandal is subpar, and I would argue that as a whole, our coverage of the WikiLeaks email scandal was really subpar last year, let us know. When we do good stuff, let us know. It's not simply, please pay for what we do and give us money. It's, yeah, pay for the things that you think are best, and tell us what works and what doesn't work. And that is really what is different about this age. You have your own printing press. And as much as we pretend not to listen to you, and as much as the first reaction you may get to be from the media is, bug off, we do listen. And just like the politicians we cover, we are affected by the criticism that we hear. And that's what I would ask for everyone.
To David, to Lydia, and to Jerry, please join me in thanking them all.
We're watching right now, tonight, as the President of the United States is orchestrating the announcement of the next Supreme Court justice in a way that really feels a lot like entertainment. Scheduled during prime time, the 2 finalists flown in. What's the antidote to entertainment? Well, one antidote we heard from Jerry Baker there: go local. Get engaged locally. Our next speaker, Lolly Bouyne, is currently a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard University, one of the great assets here on campus. She's been a reporter and writer with the Chicago Tribune since 2004, and I want to read to you something she wrote about her job. We've lost sight of how exciting it is not to have to sit in a cubicle all day long. The excitement of our work comes from meeting people and sharing their stories and sharing in their energy. I'm always amazed, even in the most tragic times, how welcoming people can be. My first mission is to just record as accurately as possible and to include stories that are diverse, that show the fullness of the city, the richness of this city, all the ethnicities here, all the cultures that exist here, because they deserve to be a part of the first unfolding of history, too. Please welcome to the stage Lale Bouin.
Thank you. You know, it may look glamorous, but being a working journalist has its high moments and some challenging moments. There are times, such as this one.
For the press, please. Anything for the press, Mr. Mayor. Did you select your security detail, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, that is me trying to get a comment from Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And yes, that is me getting the door slammed in my face. You know, practicing journalism is difficult, and readers don't even know how many times we face obstacles or how hard we have to hustle in order to get our jobs done. There are times when we get doors slammed in our face, literally, like you heard. There are times when public officials send us boxes of paperwork because they don't think that we're going to read through every single page until we can find that news gem. There are other times when we are deliberately sent to the wrong address so that people will think we won't find just what we're looking for. When you're faced with those kind of daily obstacles, it's really easy to become cynical. You can feel despondent. You may even feel a little powerless as a journalist. But then there are other fantastic and fabulous moments being a journalist. Like this one time when I received a random fax in the office telling me about the work of Loqueta Dinkins, a woman on the south side of Chicago. I read the fax, and just like any curious journalist, I immediately jumped in my car and drove to her address. After I spent a little bit of time with Loqueta, I did some more research, and I came back to the office and wrote these words. Most of the people who lined up inside Loqueta Dinkins' small food pantry in Hazel Crest on a recent afternoon didn't even notice her lights were off. They were too worried about their own troubles, consumed with the day-to-day hustle of stretching a budget and feeding their families. It's their needs, after all, that bring them to this small warehouse where Dinkins listens to their troubles and offers them free food, clothing, and furniture, along with hugs and encouragement. Sometimes you listen to other people's problems and realize you don't have any at all, Dinkins said. For much of the 20 years that Dinkins has been running her food pantry and handing out clothing to the needy, keeping her operation going has been a struggle. She has many of the same problems her clients complain to her about. The bills pile up, utilities are cut off, debts are incurred. Dinkins' most recent trouble is a $3,500 electric bill that left her pantry in the dark. Her pantry is unusual because while most food giveaways are run by churches, social agencies, and formal organizations, the Hazel Crest effort is operated by a 65-year-old Black woman and a few volunteers who collect donations, organize the goods, and hand them out. The story went on from there. This story ran on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, and the day that it ran, I was flooded with emails and I got a number of phone calls. But I didn't hear a word back from Loqueta Dinkins, the subject of the story. After a couple days when I didn't hear from her, I got in my car and I drove to check in on her. You see, initially, Loqueta was a little shy about sharing her story with me. She didn't want to make it seem that she was bragging about her efforts to help other people. She was also a little reluctant to tell her story because she didn't want people to know that she was struggling to get her work done. So I wanted to drive to see her to make sure that she didn't feel embarrassed or ashamed in any way. When I pulled up to the food pantry, though, I was greeted with this chaotic scene. There were dozens of residents out there. They had bags of food and bags of clothing and household items that they were ready to donate. And there in the center of it all was Loqueta Dinkins, handing out orders to her volunteers and chatting with her new donors. It was amazing to see. There were people from different races and different ethnicities. There were people with different religious backgrounds who had all come because they read this story and they wanted to help save her food pantry. When I walked up on Loqueta, she was chatting with a man who had driven several hours from a wealthy, posh suburb to make a donation large enough that would cover that $3,500 electric bill. She told that man he had been sent to her by God. He said, "I don't believe in God. I believe in good people." The scene that I saw that day was so compelling and so inspiring and moving to me. It reminded me of the power of journalism. I went back to the office and I wrote about it too. You see, it's those types of moments that keep me from becoming cynical. It's those moments that help remind me that as journalists, we have the power to empower. Now, I need to tell you that when I was growing up, I didn't see reporters in my neighborhood unless there was something tragic or something violent that happened. So in my own work, I've tried to make sure that I pay attention to communities and neighborhoods and try to highlight people like Loqueta Dinkins who are doing the best that they can with the resources that they can. You see, it's when I write about someone like Loqueta Dinkins, a regular, ordinary, everyday person who is finding the best in themselves, I'm reminded of how great we are as people. Now, we all know that the best journalism highlights historic inequalities and systemic inequities. We know that the best journalism pushes back against the power structure and that it can hold public officials accountable, that it separates the truths from the alternative facts. But I'm here to remind you today that the great journalism can also find ordinary, regular people and find the extraordinary in what they do. And by doing that, then we inspire our audience and our readers to dig down deep and find their own generosity and find their own passions and their own ways that they can change and contribute to this world. You see, I think that when we tell those types of stories, we show people how to relate to each other. We help ourselves like each other a little bit more. And I truly believe that when we learn about those stories and that we share those stories, that is the path to bridging the division and helping us find true solidarity. Thank you.
I have to say, Lolly, I think that's one of the most inspiring things I've ever heard. Our last speaker tonight is also an inspiration to me. You know, over the last few months, I'd say 24 months, trying to navigate the insanity of this campaign season and the press coverage to go with it, I found myself just desperate for a plumb line, for a clarity about the moment we're in as a culture and a nation. And I returned again and again to Brian Stelter, to his email list, which I encourage you to join, but also to his Sunday morning show on CNN, Reliable Sources. Please welcome to the stage, Brian.
Are you sure we can't just wrap it up after that? I have been working on my comments, listening to the panel, listening to the speakers, here to try to wrap up this afternoon with some optimism about this age we're in, this alleged post-truth, post-fact age that we're in. I've tried to incorporate some of what Bill Kristol was saying in the beginning all the way to the very end here. I think Kristol was making important points about the press, about how powerful we are or we are not. And I think we need to confront that today. This is it. This is the time that journalists live for. You can feel it watching cable news. You can feel it holding the paper, reading the paper if you still read the paper in print. You can sense that journalists know this is a historic moment for the country, but for the profession. The best of times and the most unpredictable of times. Will news, as we know it, even survive? I think we've got to talk about that. Can news, as we know it, survive if we think it's a post-fact era? Now, I dismiss that. I don't think it's a post-truth, post-fact era. It's only a post-truth world if we all in this room let it be a post-truth world. If we all collectively, all of us, give up on truth. But will news as we know it survive? Attempts to delegitimize the profession. Can news as we know it actually thrive would be the more optimistic question. And I think the answer is yes, but I want to just begin by briefly underscoring what the panelists were talking about before. The questions right now do not get any bigger than the ones that were coming up a few minutes ago. The moment does not get more serious than this. On Sunday, January 22nd, President Trump woke up for the second morning in the White House, and I asked on my CNN program, will President Trump deny reality on a daily basis? Will he make up fake facts and false statistics? And unfortunately, so far, the answer is yes. Daily falsehoods, daily deflections in ways that shock and frustrate the hell out of the people covering him. Every president spins, but Trump makes them look like amateurs. I mean, before this election, there was a failure of imagination, and that's really what I wanted to mention about the pessimistic part of my comments. Before the election, there was a failure of imagination. It wasn't that the polls were completely wrong. It wasn't that the analysis was completely wrong. The amount of fantastic journalism, prize-winning journalism, was extraordinary. But there was a failure of imagination, and I think we've got to, in this moment, not make that mistake again. We have to imagine what this new administration can and could do to further delegitimize and disrupt the press. We're seeing it in the press briefing room on a daily basis. We're seeing it on Trump's Twitter feed. We have to imagine these scenarios. If I can be blunt, we have to imagine how bad it could get. And I don't think a lot of journalists want to or have done that. I don't think a lot of newsroom leaders have necessarily done that. I'm not saying we should assume the worst. We should not assume anything about this presidency. We should not assume everything he's doing is good or bad. We should not assume anything. But we have to anticipate worst-case scenarios for the Fourth Estate in particular. How this government could use the power of the state to punish truth-telling journalism and tamp down on dissent and shame critics. We're 11 days in. This is the time, a little bit late, this is the time to anticipate and plan for the worst-case scenarios. And media lawyers are doing that. First Amendment groups are doing that. But I think we've got to have more journalists have their eyes wide open about the possibilities. Of course, the Obama administration withheld information, pursued leakers, was not a friend of the press. But again, Trump may make Obama look like an amateur on this front. So let's not hesitate to talk about the possibilities, talk about the storm clouds of authoritarianism. Let's not make the mistake of that failure of imagination. But this is where I turn from being pessimistic to optimistic, thinking about what the audience wants and needs. What they don't need is for us to make any assumptions. What the audience needs right now is I'm flooded by emails every day. Flooded, I don't know how they're finding my email address. All of these viewers, all of these readers, all of these newsletter subscribers, by the hundreds every day saying we are counting on the news media. We are not buying this attempt to delegitimize the press. We need you, and I'm talking about me. They're talking about the big newsrooms of this country that they are depending on for information. I think those emails and the ratings and the traffic data all indicates an audience hungry, maybe even starving for journalism right now. And that is why I reject this talk about being post-fact, post-truth. People are watching, people are reading. Lydia's Huffington Post, Katie's Boston Globe, all of them seeing huge surges in traffic. We all know about the New York Times and other outlets gaining subscribers as well. Just today, just this afternoon, while we're sitting here in my inbox, The Atlantic saying it set an all-time daily audience record on Sunday, and then again on Monday yesterday. CNN, 1 million viewers every hour of the day on Sunday, again on Monday. Normally, 500, 600, 700,000 is a good figure. These numbers are through the roof, online and on TV. And partly that's because of the protests, partly that's because the country is hungry for information right now. Every day is a better day for access to information. And that, I think, more than anything else, is a reason for young journalists to be optimistic. Not to give up on this profession, as some of them tell me they're considering, not to fear entering the profession of journalism just because the president says he's at war with it, but actually to seize the opportunity. Every day there are people who, for the first time in their lives, have access to a smartphone and access to our work, to our stories, to our videos. I know I make the mistake of taking that for granted sometimes. But in this moment, I'm trying to remind myself and all of you, as Bill Kristol was saying in the very beginning, this access to information, this ability to reach increasingly the whole world with our content. So that brings me to our title here, and that brings me to my final point, the future of news, the future of news. The future of news is all of the above. The future of news is all of you. News does not start and end anymore. There's not a morning print edition anymore. It's not a 6:30 p.m. newscast. It's not even a 24/7 product anymore. It's always on and it's on demand. News is all the time, all over our devices. I kind of think we consume news like sponges, not even knowing sometimes where and when and how we are getting it, how we're consuming it. But that's the future of it, more of all of the above. And if we're not reckoning with what Snapchat and Facebook are doing to the future of news, then again, we're not having that imagination we have to have at this moment, both in negative and positive ways. We know that as sources go direct, as President Trump tweets and Facebooks his announcements, our job more and more is about vetting. And right now, verifying. Right now, the conversation's about Trump's tweets, but that's just an example. That's just today's example of sources going direct. Let's remember that to his supporters, Trump's tweets are news. They are news. They are the same as or similar to a story written about his tweets. To Elizabeth Warren's supporters, the same is true. Her tweets are news. But what are tweets really? These are just press releases. These are just new forms of press releases. They're really links. And what I see on social media now are people wielding links like weapons, using news as weapons, fighting, battling with each other, trying to win arguments using these links like they're swords. What we do in that environment is we have to create our own links. We have to create our own responses, our own versions. It doesn't mean that we are at war, but it means providing all the information that our newsrooms have, the fact-checking and all of that we sometimes don't bother actually putting on the internet and creating a link to. Increasingly, as sources go direct, we have to verify, and it puts the impetus back on us to show why we know something is fake or why we know something is true and how we know it. But many Americans, I would say on a positive day, most Americans do care about sources of information, do care about the truth. They may be skeptical of us and want to know how we arrived at the truth, but do care about knowing what is true, wanting to feel and be smart, wanting to be nourished by the news, not wanting to consume it or watch it just to resent or hate the other side, but to actually know a little bit more. It's not just my inbox that's stuffed with people that want and need more of that want more information. Again, I think we see signs of it all around, and that's what should give us optimism in this difficult moment. I think for the young people in this room, for the students in this room, startups and new news organizations can be built from the ashes of this election. Something new, something that may it connect to a voter who no longer trusts a New York Times or a Boston Globe or a local TV station. It's a moment for reinvention and creation, but not a moment to be pessimistic. We should think through the possibilities, be prepared for those worst-case scenarios, but recognize there's an abundance of great journalism today. People like me obsess over the mistakes that happen. That's the other part of my inbox. People complaining about the errors and the accidents and the misinformation. That is true and that is real, but there's an abundance of great journalism every day. Not horse racy coverage, not clickbaity coverage, but real, rigorous reporting. That is what we should celebrate. That is what we should defend and point out. We are not post-truth. In conclusion, all of us are the future of news. To go back to the title, all of us are the future of news. All of us can seek out great journalism. All of us can support it and help spread it. But let's recognize this is the moment journalists live for. This, right now, these weeks, these months, these 4, maybe 8 years, this is it. Thank you.
I just would like to give everyone who was on stage today one final round of applause. And echo Brian's point. You are the future of news. It's my greatest hope that this event has inspired some of you not only to become journalists, but to help tackle the challenges of the business model of news. I will close with a brief quote from Wayne Barrett, who just died. So I say, stew, percolate, pester, track, burrow, besiege, confront, damage, level, and most of all, care. Thank you.